Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Swindon Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss, how would a stateless society deal with low ability people? Tim.
You could use other words to describe the last category, but I'm not trying to be obviously unpolitically correct on purpose, because this to me is an intellectual question. It's not merely trolling. But how would the low ability people? There is a pre-answer to this question, which I will anticipate you would say, as well as others would say, is that in a stateless society or an ideal society, there'd just be less of these people. And I think that might be the case. This is somewhat contra what progressives think, well, in particular the right-wing anarchist version. I would say the state school system and state-backed university system is a jobs and pensions program for middle-class women and a few other groups. Another way to look at schools is to think about the hidden curriculum. This is the hidden curriculum is times more important than the so-called actual curriculum. As the French general said after the Franco-Prussian War, the schoolmaster won the last war, and the schoolmaster will win the next war. The decline of technical education and apprentice programs is also problematic for those without an academic disposition or those on the low ability side. The very structural school seems to be looks pointless for many men, especially early on, which seems to set this problem up. I mean, this in particularly helps the so-called black community in North America. Despite all the talk about progressives, about so-called racism, they create a school system and they run a school system which is mainly benefit for women. Drugging, juvenile detention, and so forth are all common as you go down the cognitive scale, and one gets increasingly this way. And this affects everyone too. It's not just one group too. So that's the first case. There could be less of them because you might not have this monstrosity of a education system propped up by the state, propped up by the military, and so forth. Okay, in a stateless society or an ideal society, this sort of mirrors our what does an ideal society do about crime episode. You could just say there'll be less of crime. That might still be the case. There could, there is a sort of general rise in ability potentially that could happen if you had better institutions. I also think a persuasive case can be made that a better society in which the state isn't controlling the education as well as licensing laws, no monopoly, state monopoly capitalism, and so forth, would be more responsive to the actual needs of the actual population. But I don't think the problem of low ability people is going away. I mean, what ought to be done about these folks? Many people on the left, in particular the Christian left, such as David Bentley Hart and Elizabeth Brunig of the Washington Post, as well as certain paleos on the right, will make the case that libertarian and anarchists just don't care about the poor. You see this, for example, on Twitter. You see this on Christianity Today all the time. They accuse them of being classical liberal Ayn Randians with a dose of Nietzschean worship of power. I think they should at least listen to the previous two paragraphs. Because they will support the school system, but as I stated, the school system seems to harm many of the groups they claim to help, despite all the talk of a W, as Nassim Taleb would call it, TAWK. It's no action here. On the one of the ways in which the right is more attuned to reality. I think there's a quote by H.L. Mencken. He's not talking about the right, but this is in his example here. Is despite what the Declaration of Independence says, all men are created equal. That is clearly not the case. A very good PFS questioner asked the Council of Boogeymen, Lynn, Spencer, Gottfried, that was the Council of Boogeymen, back maybe 10 years ago, this very good question. Why doesn't the left use difference as an argument for more state intervention? If people are all the same, then in a sense there's a limit to what the state can do. If everyone has the same ability to complete let's say a running assignment or a math problem or figure out how to fix a washing machine or something like that, if everyone is equal, then there, in a sense, the state has less justification. Now, state for intervention. If people in the sense are different, then this would actually be an advocate for more state interference into all sorts of areas, because in order to get equality, you'd have to raise up a lot of different people. You have to spend more money on them, and so forth here, not just the same amount. Um, so that's one question that's interesting to ask here. State welfare, which is a common solution to this problem, um, or is the de facto solution, comes with other problems. Now, as people as far flung as Michel Foucault would argue, that welfare is a kind of prison housing system. To there's a existential comics cartoon which Foucault calls everything a prison. But state welfare does, so to speak, keep people down. It is a kind of warehousing of the poor. And actually, a lot of the early Marxists and early anarchists. I mean, this is what interesting. Chris Crotone reports this of all people. He was a Marxist on the Platypus Affiliated Society. Would report that some of the early Marxists might have supported the social democratic welfare state, but they did it with asterisks, so to speak. They said, "Well, this is just a means to control and to prevent revolution. It's not a means. It's not an actual good thing in itself. It depowerizes people." Now, this might not be the case with the people in the way bottom, but it is on the middling range. Because even if you're a carpenter, for example, you have a skill, you have a useful thing to do. When you're destitute or you're just housed, so to speak, you don't really have any skill that the ruling class or the elites or society itself needs. It also crowds out local private charities and mutual aid networks as well. So those are some overview of the topic here. So Swithin, what do you think about solutions to this problem? I mean, your solution is always um, voluntary slavery, which I would argue is an oxymoron, because slavery is done for profit, and no one would voluntarily enter that contract here. And I will also say that the kind of person I'm aiming at, you're not going to put these people in charge of the aircraft control system, at least yet. I mean, I doubt Joe Biden's security detail or Stalin's security detail or the University of Chicago's security detail is full of dunces and people of no ability or low motivation. I doubt. So small businesses and churches at times hire these people, but they don't do important jobs. So then what do you? So that to me is, to some extent, since the rise of industrialization, manual labor's value has gone down, because no matter how many people with shovels, a caterpillar excavator does a better job. So then what do you make of this topic, and what do you make of my opening comments, and what ought to be done to ask the Leninist question here? Swithin?
I agree with you with respect to sort of regulation, licensing, the schooling system, etc. That's all true. Those with lower cognitive ability would be able to be more valuable in such a society economically than they are at present. I suppose it depends on how low ability we're talking, because if we're talking about someone with seriously low ability, they're basically a dependent, like a child. And in that case, well, there's not really much else you can do with them apart from basically treat them like a child. Now, that might then require their family to look after them or something like that. If we're talking about people who are just a bit stupid and maybe as well don't really make the best decisions about themselves, they're the type of person who would, I've got some money now, what should I do? I should buy a lottery ticket. Or, I've got some money now, I should drink it away down at the pub. If you're going to talk about those people, then those people you could say are sort of, in principle, could be sort of relatively independent, but aren't. And so, how do we account for those type of people? So I would say, insofar as they do provide some value, then they could be employed by small firms. That's true. Would they provide that much value for them? It seems to at least be able to do it at the moment. You mentioned charities is quite a good point. That they do employ them. I mean, a decent number now seem to be employing people with Down syndrome, and they seem to be do an adequately good job of what's required, and it seems to be useful and valuable in certain respects, because what you want to do with these types of person is to give them something useful to do, and it's not merely a mate work program, because, well, that just is not hugely motivating, because, well, what's the point of doing this? So you mentioned that I supported some sort of voluntary slavery of some description. Well, what I was imagining was, if you have somebody who is you know, somebody who's got some skill in, technically speaking, but they're very poor at their overall life decision making, and could be useful to a corporation of some description, maybe in some relatively skilled manual activity. It's almost certainly illegal at the moment, but to sign very, very long-term contracts, which are very difficult to get out of, requires specific performance. So you couldn't just get out of them by paying them off. And actually, these type of people probably wouldn't have very much money to buy themselves out of a contract anyway. So you'd need other ways of sort of like recompensing the sort of slave. Well, it's not. The firm, for instance, say it's the firm, and if you were to do that, then they could provide security for people. This is one thing that many people mention about, well, actual slaves in the antebellum South, and also in Eastern Europe, is that certain people like security. They like the fact that they're going to be looked after by the state or by their slave owner. I don't remember the exact details, but there was records of what slaves thought about ex-slaves in I think it was the early 20th century in the US, and they're asked, what did they like? What were their experiences of being slaves in the antebellum South? And many of them were very positive, and they probably liked the fact that they had this sort of personal relationship, rather than having a purely contractual relationship. Now, it is a contractual one, but if it was like such a long-term contract and they were obligated to pay you insofar as you perform certain actions, it's not like a situation you can have today where people with relatively low productivity can just be fired at whim by by corporations and have a very sort of tenuous existence. And this is an argument Chris Catrone makes. And so you could sort of ape this with like a sort of a contract of some description, which would hopefully avoid the excesses of certain slave owners, and would provide the security to the individual with the accompanying obligations. I suppose in a way you could treat it a bit like UBI with strings attached, in a way. You've got to do this for your sort of master. I was going to be master, probably better than a slave owner in this case, rather than with the UBI one is you just exist, so we'll give you some money. So I think that is a potential solution. In practice, will people get screwed over? Maybe. It depends on how good the court systems are. But, we're a stateless society. We're going to talk about, have we got some decent courts? We don't have absurd legal practices which are difficult to follow, etc. So I think that's an interesting potential solution, if there is still such a great one, is that kind of long-term contract which is hard to get out of. Another way of avoiding the problem, though, I would say, is to try to reduce the number of low ability people to begin with. Now, that then raises the alarm bells. Haha, eugenics! To which I respond, well, yeah, so. The question is what type. So in today's society, there is, because especially women don't need to make babies with men who have money, because they can always go to the big sugar daddy of the state. So, and also as well, for many sort of, how should we say, women who are unlikely to get a high status, particularly high status male, one of the ways of getting lots of resources for themselves is to have kids and become the welfare queen, which is clearly a dysgenic situation. There was one author, I don't remember his name, he wrote a book called The Welfare Trait, in which he was saying that the welfare system, Adam Perkins, that the welfare system was breeding sort of antisocial personality, because personality is to some extent heritable. And I think also, and it's more socially determined than IQ. But you were basically having a system which was incentivizing um, more or lower quality people coming into business, and then of course the feminism on the other side, in which you have high ability women who have very, very, very few children. And actually, this even started in the late 19th century. This is where sort of the population stuff was getting some of the sort of traditional sort of progressives, eugenicists who were concerned about this. So I think the abolition of welfare in there and having more sort of traditional sort of Christian marriage practices, forms of arranged marriage of some description, basically make it more difficult for men to access sex without marrying somebody. And so this would then mean, in most cases, that they would need to be of higher ability than just a guy who looked good and gave a girl a good time. Oh no, we've got a baby. That would be minimized. And so then you would have, on average, the people who would reproduce would be ones of more ability. And so you would have, hopefully then, on average, a better quality of raw material of person in society as a whole. So that would be a way. Although another possible problem with this, though, is insofar as the stateless society is technologically developed and you can save babies who otherwise would die, then you might end up with people who are more retarded because they otherwise wouldn't have died. So you could have both aspects, but I still think that would have beneficial outcomes, at least with the marriage practices. So those are a couple of options that could be taken.
The question you flipped, which was perfectly fine. You flipped to number 3 in my document here, which discussed abortion and eugenics. To the certain extent in which we already have it, for better or for worse, we already have it, and even though you made the argument about the, so to speak, welfare queen, there is an extent in which there's a certain lower bound which basically no one has sex with, contrary to what feminists and egalitarians think. There was a libertarian who has a blog called Overcoming Bias. And he made this argument that 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 men of a particular type don't have as much access to sex because they're very socially awkward or they're very physically awkward. So there's a certain sense which men and women of a certain ability, we already do this. I mean, you ask a middle class white woman in the West, would you want to date a homeless guy? And they say, I mean, would you want to go out? And in spite of all this, they generally say no. And I would say that's for good reason. I'm not just necessarily criticizing them. I'm actually criticizing their egalitarianism or their superficial egalitarianism. So I say there's a certain way in which people already do this kind of mate selection. Yes, your argument is entirely valid. 100% agree with this in a sense. But that's one thing to say, that some things we already do. And as far as the abortion is considered, this to me is always a tension deep within the Christian and the right wing about abortion and so forth. Again, famously, Richard Spencer supports abortion. There's a 50-page article, 50-page paper, which Tyler Cowen linked to on his blog, Marginal Revolution, on crime and abortion. And it seems to make an empirical argument that states, I haven't read through the whole thing, but it seems to make the argument that for every 1% rise in state-funded abortion, crime will decline by the exact same amount, or something like that. And it makes it an argument that it's a counterfactual argument, because people say, "Oh, well, the crime still exists." Well, of course it does, but it could be more. So it's a tricky argument to make. It's probably very easy for people who want to see what they want to see to poke holes into this, if they want to. But I think on a logical level, it does make sense, because the people who decide to go to get abortion, in general, aren't of the best of means. So in that sense, and it's actually one of the few statistics they do not keep by states like California and New York do not keep by race, for example, here, which is the tricky undertone of this all, especially on the right here, and so forth. So that's an area which we already, so to speak, have it. That's an area in which we already have some form, but also we have another form of it which helps gives people more access to sex and children than they otherwise would have in a, so to speak, more ideal society here. Um, so another option is, which seems to be the option that at times the Western world, in a sort of pathological way, is tending toward, sort of pathological Christian way, is attending toward, is to treat them, the low ability, like kings and queens, and worship them. There's a I mentioned this in this children's story, the Rick Story on episode we did once, and it describes to me the perfect dispensation of reality. There's two children, the brother bear, sister bear, and brother bear doesn't have a bad habit. Sister bear gets a bad habit. So the parents decided a scheme to give sister bear attention and praise, and I think money, to get over her bad habit. Brother bear, who's perfectly quote unquote normal, doesn't get that. At the end of the story, Brother Bear is somewhat jealous that Brother Sister Bear has a big pile of money for doing nothing other than returning to a normal state. Now, there might be some Christian message. The authors are Christian in this, about the two different sons who travel around the world and one stays home and so forth. There could be some message in there. So then maybe that's just, maybe Nietzsche's right. Maybe this is just Christianity at play here. Although there's also the parable of talents here. But I do think there is a tendency that certain, and even Rick Story brought up, for example, humility on our recent episode involving David Bentley Hart and free will and original sin. But there seems to me to be a tendency of people to worship handicapped people, worship the low ability. Again, I will say, white progressive women will not date these people the same way, well, at least he will not date these men, for example, and of course women and so forth. But although women have a different relationship in this marketplace or society in this sense, um, there is this there is a way in which straight UBI, and some theorists will make this point, upsets the social order. If you're a productive person who's working 40, 50 hours a week as an electrician or aircraft controller or whatever, you're not doing a David Graeber BS job, and you see other people not getting paid or living well, so to speak, not working, especially if work is a chore, you don't like doing your job, there'll be less of people doing it. This was asked. There was a Greek economist, I think is Yarvin Yaf, whatever. I cannot name his name, but there was a German taxpayer who basically accused him of just siphoning off all of Germany's surplus to give away to the poor European countries. Um, he had no answer to this question. I He had no answer to this question. It's an accusation of theft in a sense. So, I mean, I would say the only reason we have a welfare state, contrary to what David Bentley Hart, contrary to what Elizabeth Brunig, contrary to what Ted Kaczynski would say, um, is we have a rich industrialized society with productive people. Tom Woods has the great joke. Why doesn't South Africa or Zimbabwe or Malaysia just raise their minimum wage? That seems to be that's that. Why don't they just raise their minimum wage? It's like the only reason there's wealth to distribute to begin with is there's a large base of productive people, so to speak, who produce all this great stuff here. And this is a very much industrial poor. I mean, yes, the poor was a problem invented by the Christians, as Tom Holland argues. But in a way, and yes, industrialization and the delanding of certain peasants did have some negative effects. I don't deny that historical point here. But but the world of 93% subsistence farming is a very much distant world and a very much brutal world in other ways too. So that's a historical point here that seems sort of far flung, but I think it does have a point. So Swethan, what do you make about the worshiping point? Do you think that's what society is trending toward in our, in the United Kingdom, in USA, in Canada? That seems to be, I mean, COVID lockdowns were very much a worship of that. What do you make of the origins of it, and how do we stop doing that? And do you think that's a problem, so to speak? Swithin?
Well, yes, it is a problem. It's it's a weird situation. It is, again, as ever, this kind of thing is kind of a post-Christian sort of approach. Um, but weirdly, it, it has you're sort of like worshipping low ability people, but and then you're saying to them that, well, they can do anything they want to do when of course they can't. And it's this kind of weird egalitarianism that, well, everybody can reach this potential, but only if we come and help them. And then we can raise them up. It's kind of like a white man's burden thing again, but this time, instead of the black people, it's anybody who's slightly retarded. Um, so yeah, it is a really weird one. I think what you need is, you need a society again which values greatness, ability, creativity, and values outcome, values what you actually do, not just who does it. And this then ties in with the whole identity stuff and whatever. But you need, I think, a change to approaching, say, art, for instance. Art isn't good because it's socially useful. Art is good because art is good. It's good, in a sense, like an art for art's sake. We talked to Don Dooley a bit about this a couple of years or so ago. I think when it comes to the arts in particular, that's something um, that's kind of relevant. I think as well, just getting society to call a spade again. It's like you do get people who are stupid and people who are retarded, and they are. Doesn't mean we hate them. Doesn't mean we should treat them badly. They're retarded. They are retarded. Fine. But you just have all this kind of attempt to gloss over the reality that people don't want to see. So I think it was the case. Was it the? Oh yes, we used to have the Spastic Society for cerebral. Now it's just the scope. It's society like cerebral palsy. Um, Oh yeah, and then of course Downs used to be mongoloidism and stuff like that. If you were to return to more of something like that, I think you would sort of get someone in the right direction. Just back on the sort of eugenicist point, you are right. It tends to be the lower social class women who have abortion. That's certainly true. Um, so, I mean, when I was talking about children as well, I'm talking about contraception as well. Um, but when it comes to the who has children, it is always the case that I think if you look historically, before sort of marriage became like official marriage wasn't the norm as much. I think it was like 1930s or before. 95% of women married on ever, and 90% of men did. So there was always a group of men who you wouldn't marry. The thing is, and you talk about the nerdy people who are kind of awkward, those are the people who actually socially would be somewhat better than the sort of uh, the better sort of Chad type, sort of like the American football player who's an idiot, but's actually physically reasonably attractive and strong. Those are the type of men that attract the sort of lower quality women and end up being the father typically in these situations. And so actually the sort of provider, as it were, beta male is the one who is most harmed by the welfare state, because even though he's not particularly attractive and he's not particularly interesting, he is defendable and he would provide some resources and would be an okay husband, but he's kind of muscled out by the state. And if you had a choice between them reproducing and violent and pretty stupid Tyrone, I'm pretty sure that on average you want beta male to be reproducing rather Tyrone. That's probably likely. So yeah, you want to think about those dynamics as well. But yeah, you are right. There's always going to be a certain group of men who aren't going to marry because, in general, there are far more stupid men than there are stupid women. It's just the way the bell curve works. But yes, we to go just to circle back to the first bit again. We need a society that values outcomes and not ones that sort of trying to level the playing field constantly and sort of value human achievement in a way. I mean, I suppose that's making me sound somewhat Randian, but I don't think that's entirely out of place.
I want to quick retouch a point. You said you said that. you can do anything you want. It will just your help. This to me seems the attitude that the schooling system has, and Brian Kaplan.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, exactly it.
And that attitude to me is somewhat pathological. I mean, no one, like for example, the I think who won the NBA uh MVP last year is, I think he's like 6'7". He's a very physically strong guy. Like, as much as I like Michael Humer, or as much as I like um I'm thinking of other short, very intellectuals I think of, or maybe Rishi Sunak. Richard's story was talking about him. Um, you know, I don't think they could be the MVP. Now that's an example which people get annoyed, progressives get annoyed when you bring up, when they bring up sports examples. And everyone has been involved in gym, or at least used to, and they have a draft about players. And I would generally get drafted toward the bottom, which is completely reasonable, especially at my size, for a game of kickball. Although as an adult, I'm probably in better physical shape than them. Than at the time. But seems to be something that's very about the schooling system, as Brian Kaplan would argue, is very pathological. And the decline of technical education and apprentice education, and replacement of credentialed education just for getting a piece of paper. Like the seems to now you could blame that somewhat on sort of late industrialization. But if you look at like job shortages, I believe there is a shortage of like welders. I believe there is a shortage of like technicians and contractors. There's actually a recent South Park episode that was somewhat leading into this point here, where it had white collar workers begging for the service of handymen to fix their fridge or something like that. So there does seem, and actually, and for the third level, I was listening to John Mersheimer, who was talking about, the strengths of Russia's economy. And one of the strengths of Russia's economy is that it can actually produce tanks. To the extent that its population is more attuned to manual labor and so forth, and that in fighting like a World War One style war, it has more draft it has enough draft eligible men and industrial base to do this kind of, go, same way with North Korea, and same way with some of these other countries. So there is a base level thing which of sort of hard industrial jobs, which seem to be quite valuable, which the progressive schooling system more or less disenfranchises. I'll use that word. But then, what do you make of this point? Do you think that's a genuine point? And I mean, I would assume a stateless society wouldn't have subsidies towards white collar workers or management, unless it's necessary. Then they'll be needed. But there seems to be a process where that happens. With it,
Oh, yeah, that's entirely true. I mean, everybody is sort of directed in the schooling system. Well, for one thing, with the schooling system, to do the next rung of the schooling system, because that's how it justifies itself. How do you justify graduating high school? Because then you go to college. And so how do you justify college? Well, you might need a master's. Oh, why don't you need a master's? Well, you need a PhD. And why don't you need a PhD? Well, you might get a job in academia at that point. Now, obviously, when you get to the college thing, it's a lot more on employment. But I mean, it's how it justifies itself. So it does sort of very much tend towards. It very much does tend towards that, and also as well, the personality type that the schooling system generates, as you've mentioned before, is very much more geared towards women, and it just doesn't suit, especially many mechanically practically inclined men. In a stateless society where you won't have the barriers to entry, so that it's comparatively easy for independent small firms to set up and provide sort of the manual services, then this is clearly going to have a situation where more men can be more productive at a younger age, which is just going to be good for society as a whole in general. But yeah, as it, and whether it's exactly designed this way, Well, it's designed this way. The result seems really to be that what the current economic system wants of the government is relatively few firms, and everyone to be employed by massive corporations who can be very, very heavily regulated. That just seems very much to be how it works, and is, of course, a problem for multiplicity of reasons. So, yeah, I would agree with your take entirely.
Yeah, the education system, whether it's designed or it's just happened to get there, whether there's a conspiracy to create this or not, the education system seems to be the root of a lot of, so to speak, the worst aspects of modernity here. And I think in this area, it's this. If some progressives or some even normie conservative Christians would come at me for this episode, I would say, look, the most everyone sort of reflexively supports the schooling system, the education system, and to go to more politically incorrect, if you look at a lot of these shooters, for example, none of them had a particularly good time in school. This to me is sort of like anti-clerical violence of like the pre-Spanish revolution, so to speak. These are sort of the protected class that sort of can uh, uh, take all its negative externalities and push them on everyone. So far from so you could strange way you could accuse me of actually doing the very thing I was criticizing, worshiping the weak here. But see, I would argue that these people are, in a strange sense, weak by this is how I defend this. They're weak because the system creates them, not because they're weak in itself. So maybe I'm the person really doing the argument here. But this system is, to me, and this is a word that I sometimes don't like to use because I don't know what it means to entirely, is that the schooling system is more unnatural than an apprentice system. The schooling system is more unnatural than the schooling and credential system is more unnatural than just word of mouth and, so to speak, that person looks like a good contractor. Maybe at 10 years old he was rambunctious and didn't pass all his tests. But as a 30-year-old adult, he's perfectly useful here. And that's another thing about this sort of, you speak about the black community in the juvenile community, which is again the accusation made that this episode is ipso facto racist, which is fine, um, to an extent here. But in that sense, the schooling system doesn't help these people at all. Baltimore. There was an article that was recently out. They've spent every year they spent more money, and every year their math scores have gone down. The exact numbers on that are could probably be argued to some extent. But the fact that they're they just seem like a pension program for one class of what of persons. So that would be my to some extent concluding comments. I think the abolition or the reformation of the education system is probably the number one thing that has to occur in our society here. I mean, you and I, we did probably well enough with the system. But you and I are probably somewhat outliers here as well. I mean, that's another thing. And the people who are intelligent enough and capable enough and have enough will or family relations will do all right. It's the people who don't, when you have a pernicious system here that's involved here. And I don't think you need. I don't think the education system is what created modernity. If anything, the education system is what destroyed the best aspects of modernity, in my viewpoint. So to those who want to say, well, if you have a modern society, you need a modern education system. Now, I know there's critiques of homeschooling and apprenticeships you can make, but I don't know how they could be worse. Maybe they could be worse. Maybe you need to warehouse all these populations from 5 years old to 15 years old. But you actually need to warehouse them because then there's the school to prison pipeline. You actually need to warehouse them the whole life. So that would be my concluding comment here. I think there would be less of them, and I also think they'd be put to better use in some way than they currently are. Although this at some level becomes a problem of evil, where my critique of you was on your voluntary slavery episode was there's not that many beneficial masters around. beneficials masters round. But I don't think the schoolmaster or the head of the teachers union or the head of the managerial bureaucracies are particularly good masters. So could it be worse? And maybe give it a chance here. I mean, maybe give abolition a chance. So that's really my final comments here. So, Ethan, do you have any more comments on my comments?
Oh yeah, I mean certainly with the schooling system and the way in which they treat people in general. I mean you can never get away with anybody else. I mean I had to do some sort of training uh, to so that I was safe to handle children, and some of the stuff they were highlighting of what abusers would do is like, well I kind of think that's kind of what schools do. It's like, isolating people from other places, other people, um, putting lots of sanctions on them if they don't do what you want them to do, etc., etc. A lot of his kind of behavior is something that's routinely done in the schooling system. I'm not saying that it's necessarily bad per se, but it's at least interesting that there's blind spots in how people perceive particular actions depending on who does them. When it comes to the schooling system, I mean, the schooling system as it's currently, well, the education system and the economy as a whole is set up for people who are agreeable, above average intelligence, and those people will do generally pretty well. Outlier intelligence will still do pretty well, but they've still got to be pretty agreeable. If they're somewhat disagreeable, they'll do very badly because we've got a very bureaucratized society, which is possibly reason why you get less sort of genius types. I mean, this is based off Ed Dutton's of characterization of the archetypal genius is someone who has moderate disagreeability and high IQ. He needs to be disagreeable so he can come up with new ideas and offend the status quo, and that's how we get that kind of development. But I would agree with you on you don't need an education to create the modernity. Modernity was created because of steam power. I mean, the modern society is an energy revolution. That's what it primarily.
Which was created by those disagreeable people,
Yeah,
from
exactly.
from my understanding.
Yeah. You get the advances in sort of the steam engine and inventions and stuff like that, and then of course as well you have the more sort of strictly scientific endeavors as well, and the sort of scientific revolution, much more empirical approach to reality. And you get investigating a double circulatory system and stuff, moving away from Aristotle's four humours and stuff like that. That's it. It's a change in disposition, and it's an energy one. It's not schooling because I mean the Industrial Revolution was. I mean the schooling system is only really exists once you've almost reached a modern society. Although, I mean, would you say the 1850 was a modern society? Well, maybe not yet. Maybe because it didn't have the motor car. But I mean, it's conceivable you could have got there before you had schools. I mean, you certainly did have. You did have vehicles in the 19th century, just weren't internal combustion engines. You actually had steam powered cars, some of them, and you also had electric powered cars as well at the time. And the electric cars still had the same problems as they did today. So I do think it's true that people of low ability, there would be more outlets to do it because the value they can provide would not be regulated out of existence in the same way it is today. But those people would still exist that couldn't even do well in that situation, and so you would still need some way of dealing with them. You just hopefully that there'd be less of them, and I think we've got good grounds for believing there would be fewer of them. And then, as I say, charity, my sort of very long term sort of master long term servant contract, whatever you want to call it, might be a way out of it as well. But it is certainly an interesting thing to think about, and it is a problem, particularly those of libertarians who go, "Oh no, when the state society things could be better," and it's be like, well, they kind of treat it as if you're going to end up with the Garden of Eden, which you won't. So those would be my concluding thoughts. I'd now just like to thank everyone for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to us on Podbean and on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings, and the more people can access this material. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason at all, please contact us at mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com.